All right, welcome back, everybody. We're still in our first edition of the text study at St. Mark Presbyterian Church for 2022. And this is episode 4 of our text study. So this will run through the end of February. And if you would like, you can be part of our live Zoom discussion. We'll have people in the room, people on the Zoom on Wednesday morning at 9:30 here at St. Mark. And of course, this is Pacific Standard Time. You can join us, but we will also capture that 1-hour discussion and put it on our YouTube page, put it on our website where you can watch it later if you need to. So welcome back. As I said, we're in our 4th study. So today we're looking at Luke chapter 6, verses 17 through 26. You can see that we skipped the rest of chapter 5. We skipped the beginning of chapter 6. And this text is going to bring us to what we call the Sermon on the Plain. And you'll see why we call it that in a moment. So once again, if you have any questions, just drop us a line on email or give us a call or something, and we'll be happy to respond the best we can. So, on with the text. Jesus came down with them and stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. They had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases, and those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured. And all in the crowd were trying to touch him, for power came out from him and healed them all. Then he looked up at his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you and revile you and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice on that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven. For that is what their ancestors did to the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets." This ends our reading. Ooh, boy. Let's begin by looking at 2 sermons and situating this sermon with relation to another. Okay, so the sermon we're reading from here, and I don't know if we really ought to be calling it a sermon. It's a teaching. That's just kind of how we frame it. So that's our imposition on the text. But we do call it also the Sermon on the Plain. And you heard me say in those first couple of verses how Jesus came down and stood on a level place. So that's why it gets the name Sermon on the Plain. But one reason that we call it that is because we're also familiar with the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount is from Matthew's Gospel. So look, we've got Luke's version of a sermon on a plain, and then you've got Matthew's version of a sermon, which is a sermon on a mountain. You can tell that Luke's takes up about 2/3 of chapter 6 in his gospel. Matthew's sermon takes 3 different chapters, and they're not short chapters. So it's considerably longer. And it's more familiar to us. You know, it comes first in the gospel. So if people are reading through the New Testament, they read Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7 before they flame out somewhere along the line. They may never get to Luke chapter 6. Songs have been written based on Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, and very few on Luke's Sermon on the Plain. So what we're up against here is that we got 2 sermons that we'll compare in a moment. One of which is far more familiar than the other. So what we want to ask is, what are the similarities of them and what are the differences of them? There are plenty of things about them that are the same, which is why we're considering them together now instead of, some random teaching from the Gospel of John. But there are also some significant differences which raise a number of questions regarding our study of the Scriptures. So let's start with the similarities between Luke and Matthew. As you heard me read it, you know that when Jesus looked up at his disciples and kind of began this teaching, this sermon, he began with the blessings. Blessed are, blessed are, blessed are. He, next week, we'll see how it moves from what we're reading today to talking about loving your enemies. He's going to have some teachings on non-retaliation. He's going to instruct us not to judge. He'll talk about how you can judge a tree by its fruit. He'll ask the question, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do what I say? And he'll talk about the importance of building a house on the rock instead of the sand, a solid foundation instead of a loose one. All of that is also in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. So if you want to look at similarities, all of them are there, okay? But there are also some differences, and some pretty significant differences. So first of all, with regard to the content, I'd say with two exceptions, everything in Luke's Sermon on the Mount is found, Luke's Sermon on the Plain is found in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. So everything in Luke, being the shorter of the two, all the content, some words will be different, but mostly the content of Luke's Sermon on the Plain will be found in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, except for two big exceptions. You would ask yourself, if you turn to Matthew chapter 5, where are Matthew's woes? So we heard in Luke, Jesus saying, blessed are the poor, blessed are the hungry, blessed, blessed, and then saying, but woe to you who are rich, woe to you who are full now, right? When you read Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, the woes are not there. So you might ask yourself, what happened to them? Did Luke add them? Did Matthew drop them? Are these just two different sermons? And on one occasion, Jesus added woes, and on the others, he didn't. In Matthew's Gospel, if you read all the way to chapter 23, then you're going to see some woes there, and it's going to look fairly similar, only each of them is directed to scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. So instead of just woe to you who are rich, or woe to you who are full, or anything like that, it's woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. And then he goes on to explain why he's offering a woe in their direction. So that's a big difference between Luke and Matthew's sermons, is Luke has these woes right here woven into the sermon right after the blessings. So we're kind of setting the blessings and the woes in this conversational mode in Luke's gospel. Also, one of the differences is very stark. Luke's language is very economic, not economical, like he says things more briefly, but he's talking about economics, whereas Matthew is talking about things that are a little more spiritual. The two great examples are in Luke, we just heard, blessed are the poor. And in Matthew, we're very familiar with blessed are the poor in spirit. It's not uncommon that if you were to quote to someone, well, Jesus said, blessed are the poor, they would try to correct you and say, no, Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit. You'll both be right. And a lot of people are unaware that Luke says, blessed are the poor, or when they read it, because of the predominance of Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, they read it as blessed are the poor in spirit. But that's not Luke's language. Blessed are the poor. And in the next one, blessed are you who are hungry. In Matthew's gospel, that becomes blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. I should check my language. Not that that becomes. I'm not presuming that Matthew's changing Luke's language. I am saying, though, it's different. Matthew's is more spiritual. Luke's is much more economical. And then, so it raises the question of whether what we're reading in Luke chapter 6 and Matthew chapters 5 through 7 are actually two versions of the same story. That could be possible. That could certainly be possible that once upon a time Jesus taught a lesson that began with blessings, perhaps had some woes, talks about love and non-retaliation and all these things, and that after that teaching there were two very separate traditions of remembering that sermon, one of which kind of ran more along economic lines and perhaps expanded with that regard, and the other ran more along spiritual lines and perhaps expanded in that regard. That's a possibility, that this was one original sermon that had been during the oral history, right? We think Matthew and Luke were written 50 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. So during that time, as these stories were passed down orally, and then perhaps written in fragments, and then became, the Gospels that we know, maybe this singular sermon took two very different tracks and followed very different paths, one of which Matthew had access to, one of which Luke had access to. Something like that. Or, another possibility is that on one occasion, Jesus preached the sermon that Matthew is recalling. It was much longer. It didn't contain the woes. It was more spiritual in nature. On another occasion, Jesus, standing on a level place, taught a similar but different sermon that did contain blessings and woes and was more about economics. It would not be unusual for anyone who does a lot of public speaking to have two different presentations with very similar themes. That's what we do, right? That's part of the nature of public speaking, is you don't just come up with entirely different takes on entirely different things every time you get up and speak. This isn't Toastmasters. This is someone who's talking from conviction, and so they're approaching it well, out of that wellspring of conviction. So biblical scholars are just not real sure how we have these two different sermons. Let's remember some of the fundamental basics of critical biblical scholarship. Not every biblical scholar is going to agree on all the exactitudes of this exactly, but in general, it is thought that when it comes to Mark, Matthew, and Luke, that Mark's gospel was written first. There are significant scholars who want to argue with the order of things, but in general, that Mark's gospel was written first, that Matthew and Luke had some access to Mark's gospel, perhaps even a copy of it in hand, partly because they all follow the same sequence of stories, the same story arc, and sometimes in very detailed similarity, which would seem like they've got it right in front of them in some form or another. But there are also some stories that Matthew and Luke have in common that are not found in Mark. Almost everything in Mark's gospel is found in Matthew and Luke. But there are some stories that Matthew and Luke share that Mark doesn't have. And one of the conjectures is that Matthew and Luke had another source, access to another source, commonly. It's called the Q source. And that they drew from that as well. So they have Mark in hand. They also have this Q source in hand. And they share that. And then Matthew has some stories that are not in Mark or Luke. And Luke has some stories that are not in Mark or Matthew. And so we presume, then, conjecture again, that Matthew had some sources that were unique to Matthew, and Luke had some sources that were unique to Luke. This Sermon on the Mount Sermon on the Plain, the relationship between those two really fuzzies up everything for us. Are Matthew and Luke drawing from the Q source? Are they drawing from two different versions of that so-called Q source? Are they just drawing from two very different traditions? Did Jesus, in fact, teach two different lessons, two different sermons that came out similar but very different? We don't know. Anytime we climb behind the text and start trying to pay attention to what's called the redaction history, redactive analysis, we get on thinner and thinner ice because we have to make some educated guesses. I say this is a thing among critical biblical scholars. I want to argue that anybody who reads Matthew and Luke's different sermons and tries to reconcile them or relate them in some way is dealing with this very same question. Even if someone reads Luke's sermon through the lens of Matthew's sermon and assumes that blessed are the poor means blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the hungry means blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, they're making a judgment call that Matthew got it right and more precisely, and Luke somehow is not presenting the sermon the way Jesus wants us to hear it. So this is an interpretive question that you face whenever you read either Luke or Matthew, and particularly when you step back and try to hold them together in some fashion. So I'll be interested on Wednesday in hearing what you think the relationship between the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain is. So let's pay now just strict attention to this Sermon on the Plain from Luke's Gospel. And we'll start with an outline because I don't want you to miss a couple of things. It begins with a setting, verses 17 through 19. And too bad that the sermon that follows this setting gets all the attention because its setting has some really interesting stuff in it. First of all, there is that mention that Jesus comes down from a mountain to a level place, or from a higher place to a level place. That's kind of curious because we don't really see that being pointed out fairly commonly in Luke's Gospel. And Luke mentions that there's a great crowd of disciples. And there's just a huge crowd generally, and he names Tyre and Sidon, all of these places where people are from. It kind of helps us to ask the question, what is a disciple? We sometimes just apply that term narrowly to the 12 and, think it's another word for apostle. Luke is using it very broadly here, and it's a little unclear whether he's referring to all the people that are gathered there as disciples, or that there's a huge crowd there, and of that huge crowd, a big crowd is full of disciples. It's kind of hard to tell, because the first few verses are all about what Jesus is doing. He's teaching, he's healing, he's exorcising oppressive spirits. This is all fabulous, fascinating stuff. And occasionally in all of the synoptic gospels, you get these are called summary sentences that just kind of generally talk about Jesus doing healings, teachings, and exorcisms without stopping to describe a particular one. And this is one of those moments. And there's also in this introduction, or this setting, there's an interesting phrase that as Jesus was healing and exorcising oppressive spirits, it says, power was coming out of him. Go back and look at that phrase, because I want to lift that up on Wednesday and talk a little bit about what that means. It's kind of a reification of healing power as kind of a thing that moved from here to there, and that's kind of curious. I want to talk about what Luke seems to mean by that, and what we're supposed to think of that phrase, that power came out of him. We will see it in other places in the Gospels, so it's not, unique, but it's also not very common. So after the setting in those first 3 verses, then the next 4 verses are all about blessings. Blessings. Now, here are the folks who are declared blessed: the poor, the hungry, weeping, hated, excluded, reviled, defamed. And they're supposed to rejoice. Those are all the hallmarks of every adventure movie you've ever seen, whether it's John Wayne or the Avengers, where the hero is either impoverished or mistreated or maligned in some way, and the next thing you know, the rest of the movie is all about justice by taking some sort of vengeance. So we don't, in our popular imagination, imagine that the poor and the hungry and the maligned like this are blessed. So when we read this, that's a challenge. And then look at the woes. That's the last 3 verses of our reading are woes. Woe to you who are rich, who are full, who are laughing, and when all speak well of you. Folks, that is an entire section of books at Barnes & Noble on how to get exactly that, right? Everybody in America seems to have something like that in mind when they go to college or when they get out of school and start looking for a job. These are the things toward which we aspire. And every church in America would love to be well-financed and full and laughing and have a good reputation. So this is hard. It's just kind of kooks and obnoxious people who somehow pride themselves on being hated and try to turn that into being, some form of persecution. But generally, we don't find rich, full, laughing, and people speaking well of you of being a problem. So, this text is full of challenges. It's full of challenges, the first of which is none of this makes sense, right? It really turns our world upside down, and not just our common expectations, but our philosophical approach to life, that the good life, eudaimonia, means joy, right? Yeah, having a good, full life, dying happy and all of that stuff. It kind of turns it on its head. So we have to deal with how we read this text as the Word of God, and how, in the end, this is, by the Holy Spirit, God's Word for us. The church has long been in denial about the fact that this sermon challenges our way of thinking. And so, if you read this and your first response is, this doesn't make sense, this is all wrong, then I'm going to invite you to hold that response. Don't dismiss it and don't tell yourself, oh, I'm being a terrible Christian, I can't doubt this. No, I think we're supposed to feel the rub here. So if that's your first response, don't deny it, but also don't make it your last response. Don't just say, well, this is stupid, and write it off. Let's treat it as a first response and hold it. And hold it knowing that Luke knows full well you're going to be holding this discontent. Jesus knew full well people would not hear these words and say, boy, I've always thought that myself. Okay? So let's hold that discontent. None of this makes sense. That's okay as a first response. We could also ask a very difficult question. By saying, blessed are you who are poor, blessed are the poor, is Jesus dignifying poverty, or is Jesus glorifying poverty? That's something I want to discuss on Wednesday in some detail about what it means to be poor objectively and subjectively, voluntary versus imposed poverty, and so forth. But this is another challenge. What does this say about poverty? Nobody who experiences poverty or hunger, or nobody who works with those who experience poverty or hunger, is going to come out to say, oh, it's a good thing. So what does it mean when Jesus calls them blessed? The other challenge is when you move from the blessings to the woes. Blessed are you who are poor, but woe to you who are rich, you're done for. Blessed are you who are hungry, but woe to you who are full now, you're going to starve. When we see that, it almost sounds like some sort of economic retributive justice. But when you read on in the sermon, Jesus is going to say, love your enemies. It's going to be all about a different kind of justice, a non-retaliatory justice. So that's another challenge here. What's the point? Is it going to be a good thing that people who are eating well now are going to end up hungry one day? Well, how is that good? It's another challenge of reading this sermon. And then the last part, woe to you when people speak well of you. Is it really bad to have a good reputation? And to do this, again, on Wednesday, I want to circle back to this point for a little more time, and to remember that key phrase, those who revile you on account of the Son of Man. That's what we want to pay attention to. This is not just, making a jerk out of yourself and, you're going to be blessed if everybody hates you for it. No, they're going to revile you on account of the Son of Man. So we have to lean into what exactly that very important caveat means. Okay? All right, so these are the challenges, a few of the challenges that immediately face us with the sermon, but we also have some resources. We can look at first century occupation economics. Remember, the people to whom Jesus is preaching throughout his ministry are living under the Roman Empire's occupation. And that means that they're not living under a free market economy or even a fair market economy. So we don't want to bring our presumptions to the text. And we need to look in a little more detail about what it meant to live under the occupation of the Roman Empire. We'll try to give that some time on Wednesday as well. I'm stacking up a lot of things to talk about on Wednesday, including this. I think a key interpretive moment in this story is how Jesus is aligning disciples with the prophets. Disciples and prophets. Jesus wants to see them share in the same aspiration. So that's going to be something we're talking about. What is the life of a prophet? And what does that mean as Jesus' disciples being a prophetic community? We also know that having a good reputation is not altogether a bad thing throughout the Gospel of Luke or in the book of Acts. You think in the book of Acts, the second chapter, the story of Pentecost is at the beginning, and at the end it talks about the church, and it says, having the goodwill of all the people. And Luke notoriously seems to indicate faithfulness with the church adding people daily. So popularity is not altogether a bad thing, either in Luke's gospel or in the whole Luke Acts corpus. So it helps us to kind of go back and think about what it means. Woe to you, and all speak well of you. And then, while it sounds like blessed are the poor means Jesus' disciples should have nothing, don't forget that even within this sermon, Jesus is going to speak about those who lend and those who give. So Jesus is not presuming that those who follow him are just going to be abjectly poor. They are going to have at least some capacity to be lenders without expecting anything in return, or to be givers cheerfully and so forth. So even within the scriptures, we have some resources to go back to those challenges that we lifted up and to start to imagine ways of understanding them. Okay? And then I want you to know this. Casey Hansen has a marvelous article called How Honorable, How Shameful, a Cultural Analysis of Matthew's Macarisms and Reproaches. Macarisms means blessings. That's the Greek term. Makarioi are blessings in Greek. They became Beatitudes by virtue of Latin when the Greek Bible was translated to the Latin Vulgate. And then into English, the Latin term beatitudo kind of stuck with it. But the Greek term is here, Macarisms. And Casey Hansen argues that it's less about happy or boy, are you lucky, and it's more in an honor-shame continuum. How honorable to be this, how shameful to be that. So that's something you'll want to look at. You can freeze frame here, so you can write that down and look up that article. It's free online. Okay, so next week we're going to continue with the second part of this sermon on the plain. I hope to see you there. And if you have any questions, write us a note, give us a call. I would love to hear from you. And if you're watching us and I don't know about it, drop me a line at this address, and I'd love to hear from you as well. Okay? Thanks. Bye.